The history of lynching begins with the history of America. The term lynching actually comes from an American revolutionary Colonel Lynch. And so during the Revolutionary period, Colonel Lynch, he was famous for meting out punishment on suspected British Tories. And if you were a suspected Tory, Colonel Lynch and as well as the men under his charge would summarily tar and feather you. And so the term lynching comes from Colonel Charles Lynch during the American Revolutionary period. And during this period, by and large, the individuals who would be victims of being summarily punished were white. When we get to the 1880s, the 1890s, when we're talking about black lynch victims, the intent was lethal. The intent was to expunge that person from the community. The intent was for that person's murder, right, collective murder, to be an example for others in the community. So the intent was to kill. Right, the intent was lethal, so that others in the community would sort of stay in line. They would stay under control. I mean, so lynching begins as a form of social control in the 1780s, 1790s, but by the 1880s, by the 1890s, and definitely into the early 20th century, lynching has become a form of racial social control, where the primary victims are African American and the primary perpetrators are white Americans. And so again, lynching has this long history in this country, but in the modern period, it's a racialized history. In my book, Beyond the Rope, there was a lot of evidence that I could draw upon to sort of make this argument about the multifaceted black experience of lynching. But in the main, I drew on newspapers, I drew on literature, I drew on oral histories. And the reason why I draw on these particular sources is because what I was after is to try to understand how African Americans made sense of the experience of terror, right? I was really interested in how African Americans would narrate the experience of terror. Because what we have to remember is in the 19-teens, the 1920s, and the 1930s, the civil rights movement is not on the horizon. African Americans do not know, they do not understand that 20 years later, there will be a mass movement that will upend segregation in this country. It seems from the perspective of 1910 and 1920 that segregation is going to last forever. And so if this is the reality of black people, right, the perceived reality of black people, in 1910, 1920, 1930, how do you make sense of the experience of terror in a way that gives hope to the next generation to keep fighting, right? To keep fighting. Don't give up just because it looks bleak right now. And so what I tried to do in the book is to try to explain how black Americans, right, not just regular people, but artists, writers, right, how they try to make sense of the black experience in a way that will provide hope for the future, but provide hope for the next generation. And so what I believe I uncover in the book is this tradition that I refer to as consoling narratives of the lynched black body. And so in the book, in Beyond the Rope, I try to tell the story of how African Americans began to conceive of lynching as not stories or simply stories of victimization, but also as stories of empowerment. And so in these, what I call consoling narratives, right, the lynched black body is in the background. In the foreground is who those individuals were in life and how they resisted white lynch mob violence. And if you could focus there, right, if you could focus on who they were in life, how they resisted, those elements of the story could be used to give hope to, could be used to inspire the next generation to mobilize against white supremacy, to mobilize against segregation, right? And so the goal of Consoling Narratives was to create a usable past, as long as the story revolved around dead black bodies hanging from a tree, right? That's not an empowering story. That's not a story that you can share and inspire people, empower people. And so Consoling Narratives of the Lynched Black Body were a way to move beyond the shadow of the lynching tree in a way that would inspire future action. So in the book, I focus on the story of Henry Lowry. And Henry Lowry, in many ways, I'll just say he was a victim of a lynching in Arkansas in 1920. And Lowry is important because the NAACP uses him and his case to generate a lot of attention for their anti-lynching movement. And that they were sort of getting off the ground, began in 1916, but by 1920 the NAACP is fully enmeshed in the anti-lynching crusade. And so the Henry Lowry case was a case where they really poured their resources into trying to depict him as a victim of white supremacy, as a victim of white mob violence. And so they essentially create several news releases that really emphasize Lowry as a victim, as someone whose civil rights were stripped, someone who was burned at the stake. I don't want to get into the gory details of his lynching, but it was one of the worst in American history, witnessed by at least from our estimates, 10,000 people in the Arkansas Delta. And so the Lowry case is a clear case, or at least in the eyes of the NAACP, of black dehumanization. However, it was interesting to see how the black press at the time sought to depict the case. And several publications focused in on the resistance that Lowry offered the lynch mob. They focused in on how Lowry refused to whimper. He refused to beg for his life, all to suggest his courage, his bravery, right, in the face of terror, right? And so the NAACP chose to tell a story of black victimization because they made the calculation that would help their efforts to secure an anti-lynching bill in Congress. The more they honed in on how black people were powerless, how black people were victims of white lynch mobs and lynch mobs were running amok, the more support that they anticipated that they would receive in Congress. The black press had different goals, right? They're not trying to convince Congress to pass an anti-lynching law exclusively. They're also writing to a black public who wants to understand, this case in more nuanced ways. And in particular, they want to understand who the victim was in life. They want to understand what did he do, right, in response to this, in response to his anticipated lynching. And so those are the details that several black publications, namely the Chicago Defender, would sort of base their sort of depiction of the case on. And so just with that one case, right, there are two different traditions of telling the story of lynching. There is a black victimization narrative that the NAACP believed that they needed to tell in order to get or get support for anti-lynching legislation. And then you have the consoling narrative that focused on Henry Lowry as a person, who he was as a man, right? The life that he lived in the community, as well as the resistance that he offered in response to this threatened lynching. And so that story is more resemblant of consoling narratives of the lynched black body. And so you have in just one case competing narrative traditions, right? But decidedly for the black community, telling the story of lynching was about giving hope to, right, the community, future generations, to resist white supremacy. As long as the story focused exclusively on terror, as long as it focused on dehumanized black bodies, that story wasn't a story that would create a usable past for black people, for black self-determination, for black empowerment. What I wanted to share with readers is that the black experience of lynching changed over time. What black people, how African Americans understood lynching changed over time, given the circumstances of the times. At one moment, it's really important for the NAACP to highlight black people as victims. At another time, it's really important for black people to be highlighted as resisting lynching, as fighting back against lynch mobs, because of the intended rhetorical impact that it would perhaps have on the community. And so this much more complicated story of the black experience of lynching, to my eyes, had not been told in one place. And so I wanted to tell this story as best that I could in one place.